Somewhere in your kitchen right now, there's a cup that started a revolution, toppled a king, fueled a war, built an empire, and left a trail of chains and corpses stretching across 3 continents. You think you're just having coffee. You're not. You're holding the second most fought-over commodity on earth, trailing only oil, a drink so dangerous that one sultan ordered his own people drowned in a river for touching it. A drink so intoxicating a pope had to personally taste test it to decide if it was the work of God or the devil. A drink that Voltaire poured down his throat 50 times a day, that George Washington's army rationed like ammunition, that a French naval officer nearly died of thirst protecting on a sinking ship, because he gave his own drinking water to a plant. This isn't a story about lattes. It's a story about smuggling and seduction, empire and enslavement, monks and monarchs, spies hiding treason inside a bouquet of flowers. It starts, of all places, with a goat. 9th century. The highlands of Kaffa, Ethiopia. A goat herder named Kaldi is losing his mind, not from fear, but confusion. His goats won't sleep. They're headbutting each other in the moonlight, leaping over rocks like something possessed has taken hold of the whole herd. Any sane herder would have dragged them home and prayed. Kaldi did something else. He walked over to the bush they'd been grazing on, plucked a handful of the bright red cherries they'd been eating, and popped one in his mouth. We can't prove Kaldi existed. The first time his story was ever written down was 600 years after it supposedly happened, which, in historical terms, is like citing a campfire tale as a court document. But here's the part that isn't legend. Wild Coffea arabica really does grow on those exact hillsides, in that exact shade, at that exact elevation, to this very day. Somebody in that forest discovered what those berries could do. Whether his name was Kaldi is almost beside the point. The forest is real. The plant is real. And what happened next is very real. The story goes that Kaldi, buzzing with energy he couldn't explain, brought the berries to a monastery. A monk took one look, decided this was sorcery or sin, and hurled the whole batch into the fire. That was supposed to be the end of it. Instead, the flames did something nobody expected. As the berries scorched and cracked open in the coals, a smell rolled through the monastery that stopped every monk in his tracks. Rich, dark, impossible to ignore. They raked the roasted beans out of the fire, crushed them, dropped them in hot water, and drank whatever this new thing was. That night, for the first time in memory, not a single monk nodded off during the evening prayers. Word doesn't stay quiet after something like that. It slipped across the Red Sea into Yemen, and there it stopped being an accident and became a discipline. Sufi mystics in the port cities took this dark liquid, they called it kahwa, and turned it into a spiritual weapon. Not a pleasure, a tool. They drank it to survive all-night chanting rituals called dhikr, convinced it sharpened the mind enough to touch the divine. Yemen didn't just drink coffee, they became the only nation on earth who knew how to grow it, and they intended to keep it that way. The port town of Mocha became the single choke point through which every bean on the planet had to pass, and just to make sure no one could ever steal their monopoly, the Yemenis parboiled or scorched every single export bean before it left their harbor, guaranteeing it could never sprout anywhere else. For 2 centuries, that plan worked perfectly. The rest of the world had no idea the ticking had already started. By the early 1500s, coffee had crossed from Yemen into the heart of the Ottoman Empire, and it didn't just spread, it detonated. Coffee houses called kahve khane exploded across Istanbul, Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, Mecca. These weren't polite little cafes. They were loud, smoke-choked rooms packed with men playing chess and backgammon, trading gossip, reciting poetry, and, this is the part that mattered, talking politics, openly, freely. Some historians put the number of coffee houses in Istanbul alone at over 600 by the mid-1500s. And that should terrify you a little if you were the Sultan. Because when ordinary people start gathering by the hundreds, staying wide awake, talking freely about power, the people holding power tend to panic. In 1511, the governor of Mecca, a man named Khair Beg, decided coffee itself was the threat. He declared it an intoxicant banned by Islamic law, rounded up drinkers, and shut every coffee house in the city down. His ban lasted less than a year before Cairo overruled him and stripped him of his post. Coffee had already won round 1. Round 2 was worse. Much worse. In the 1630s, Sultan Murad IV took the throne, and Murad did not do half measures. He banned coffee across the entire empire, shut down every coffee house in Istanbul, and the punishment for getting caught with a cup wasn't a fine. First offense, a beating. Second offense, drowned in the Bosphorus. Some accounts claim Murad prowled the streets of his own capital at night in disguise, personally hunting down coffee drinkers to execute on the spot. Whether every detail of that is exact truth or legend polished sharp by history, one thing is not in dispute. A man who ruled one of the largest empires on the planet looked at a cup of coffee and saw a rival government. That's how much power this drink had already accumulated, and it hadn't even left the Middle East yet. Because while Murad was busy trying to strangle coffee in its cradle, it had already slipped past his borders entirely. It had reached Europe, and Europe was about to lose its mind over it in a completely different way. The first European coffee house opened in Venice around 1629, brought back by merchants who'd tasted it in Ottoman ports. The Catholic Church took one look at this dark, foreign, intensely alluring drink from the Muslim world and reached the obvious conclusion: this had to be satanic. Priests petitioned the Vatican to ban it outright. A formal hearing was called, and Pope Clement VIII did the one thing nobody expected from a religious tribunal. He asked for a cup so he could try it himself before condemning it. He took a sip, and according to the story passed down, he said something to the effect that this drink was so delicious it would be a sin to leave it to the infidels, that the church should baptize it and claim it as their own instead. Coffee got the Pope's blessing. A sultan had been willing to drown people over this drink, and a pope was ready to bless it in the same century. That's not a beverage. That's a battlefield with a taste. Once coffee got the Pope's blessing, there was no stopping it. It swept across Europe like wildfire, and it didn't just change what people drank. It rewired how entire societies thought. By the early 1700s, London alone had more than 3,000 coffee houses. Londoners called them penny universities, because for the price of a single penny, you could buy a cup and sit for hours, listening to the sharpest minds in the country argue about philosophy, science, trade, and politics. This wasn't some velvet rope salon for aristocrats. Merchants, sailors, scientists, and radicals crowded onto the same wooden benches, all talking as equals. And some of those conversations built the modern world. Edward Lloyd's coffee house on Tower Street became the birthplace of Lloyd's of London, still one of the largest insurance markets on the planet 4 centuries later. Jonathan's coffee house on Exchange Alley became the seed that grew into the London Stock Exchange. Isaac Newton debated mathematics over cups in these rooms. The poet Alexander Pope practically lived at Buttons in Covent Garden. Cross the channel into Paris, and you'd find Café Procope, opened in 1686, hosting Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, and, at various points, Benjamin Franklin. Voltaire reportedly drank somewhere between 40 and 50 cups a day, which, frankly, explains an alarming amount about how much he managed to write. But here's the problem nobody in Europe could ignore. Every single bean fueling this continent-wide obsession still had to come from one place, Yemen. And Yemen was not interested in sharing. Every export bean was parboiled or scorched specifically so it could never be planted anywhere else. The trade routes were locked down. The monopoly was airtight. Except it wasn't. Not quite. In 1616, a Dutch trader named Peter van den Broeke did something almost nobody had managed before. He stole a living coffee plant straight out of the port of Mocha and smuggled it back to Amsterdam on a merchant ship. The Dutch East India Company nursed it to life in their botanical gardens, and then did exactly what colonial powers always do with something valuable. They shipped it to their colonies. Ceylon, Java. And that's not a throwaway detail. The word Java is still slang for coffee 400 years later because of that single stolen cutting. The Dutch also planted coffee across Suriname on the northern coast of South America, worked entirely by enslaved Africans. The monopoly Yemen had guarded for 2 centuries had just cracked open. And once it cracked, every empire in Europe wanted a piece. If you think people don't fight to the death over coffee, meet Gabriel de Clieu. In 1723, this French naval officer set sail from the Royal Botanical Gardens in Paris, carrying a single coffee plant, a cutting descended from the tree the Dutch had gifted to King Louis XIV. He was hauling it across the Atlantic to the French Caribbean island of Martinique, sealed inside a glass case on the open deck of his ship. Nothing about that voyage went smoothly. Tunisian pirates attacked the ship in the Mediterranean before they'd even cleared European waters. A violent storm nearly capsized them somewhere in the open Atlantic. Then, according to the accounts that survive, a fellow passenger, jealous or maybe just unhinged, tried to tear the plant out of its case and destroy it outright. De Clieu fought him off, but not before a branch was ripped away in the struggle. Then came the part that should sound impossible. The ship's fresh water ran critically low, and the captain ordered strict rationing for every soul aboard. De Clieu didn't just accept his shrinking ration. He started giving part of his own water to the plant. Not once. For weeks. He arrived in Martinique sunburned, dehydrated, and running on fumes, cradling a coffee seedling that was somehow still clinging to life. He nursed it into the volcanic soil of the island. Within a few years, that one surviving plant had produced enough seedlings to plant across the entire French Caribbean. Trace the genetic lineage of nearly every coffee tree across Central and much of South America today, and the trail runs back to that single scraggly cutting a man nearly died of thirst to protect. But the story of coffee's conquest of the Americas has one more twist, and this one reads less like survival and more like a spy thriller. By 1727, Portuguese Brazil was staring at millions of acres of perfect coffee-growing land, tropical climate, rich soil, and no legal way to get the plant. The French and Dutch were guarding their coffee colonies as jealously as Yemen had once guarded Mocha. So Brazil sent a man named Francisco de Melo Paleta on an official diplomatic mission to French Guiana, publicly framed as help settling a border dispute between French and Dutch settlers. Privately, his real assignment was theft. Paleta was charming, well-spoken, and, according to the record, extremely good at his actual job. During the negotiations, he reportedly began an affair with the wife of the French colonial governor. When his mission ended and it came time to leave, she handed him a farewell gift at a public banquet, an elaborate bouquet of flowers. Hidden inside it were fertile coffee seeds and cuttings. Paleta carried that bouquet back across the border into Brazil, planted the seeds in the northern state of Pará, and within decades, coffee cultivation spread through Maranhão, Bahia, Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Minas Gerais. Brazil became the largest coffee producer on Earth, a title it still holds today, growing roughly a third of the world's coffee supply. Sit with that for a second. An industry worth tens of billions of dollars a year, feeding half the planet's morning routine, exists because of a stolen bouquet at a dinner party in 1727. It's a great story. It's also where the story stops being charming. Here's where this story stops being a quirky adventure about spies and stolen plants and becomes something you can't look away from. Every empire that planted coffee across the tropics built those plantations on the backs of enslaved people. The Dutch worked enslaved Africans and forced local labor across Java and Suriname. The French relied on enslaved Africans throughout Haiti, Martinique, and Guadeloupe, and conditions on Haiti's coffee and sugar plantations were so brutal that they became one of the sparks that ignited the Haitian Revolution in 1791, the only successful slave revolt in history that founded a nation. And then there's Brazil, which would eventually outproduce every other coffee nation on earth combined, and did it almost entirely on enslaved labor, all the way up to 1888. Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery, and coffee was one of the economic engines keeping that system alive for as long as it lasted. The conditions were staggering. On plantations across the Paraíba Valley and around São Paulo, enslaved workers labored from before sunrise until after dark, clearing dense forest, planting seedlings, hand-harvesting ripe cherries under brutal tropical heat, processing beans in open-air yards. Plantation owners, known as fazendeiros, calculated, coldly on paper, that it was cheaper to work people to death and buy replacements than to invest in better food, shelter, or care. The wealth all of that labor generated flowed upward, to landowners in Brazil, to commodity traders in London, Amsterdam, and New York. The people who actually built the industry with their hands never saw a fraction of it. This isn't a footnote to the coffee story. It's the foundation the whole global industry was built on top of, inseparable from the plantation economies that shaped 3 continents. Every time this history gets told as a fun tale about goats and popes and stolen bouquets, this is the part that gets left out. It shouldn't be. But the story doesn't end there, because an ocean away, coffee was about to help birth a brand new nation, almost by accident. Think about everything that had to happen for you to drink coffee this morning. A goat herder had to notice his animals acting strange enough to risk eating a wild berry himself. A monk had to throw those same berries into a fire and be wrong about them being cursed. Sufi mystics had to turn a random discovery into a spiritual weapon strong enough to spread across an empire. A sultan had to become so afraid of a drink that he ordered his own people drowned for enjoying it. A pope had to personally taste test Satan's drink before deciding to bless it instead. A Dutch trader had to steal a living plant out of a heavily guarded port. A French naval officer had to give up his own drinking water for weeks to keep a seedling alive on a sinking ship. A Portuguese diplomat had to seduce his way into a bouquet full of stolen seeds, and an entire economic system, one built on the enslaved labor of millions of people across 3 continents, had to exist to turn all of that into the industry we now take completely for granted. That's not the story of a beverage. That's the story of human ambition in its rawest form. Brilliant, brutal, and unstoppable all at once. Every single time someone tried to lock coffee away, ban it, monopolize it, or kill it off, it found a way out. Through fire, through smuggling, through war, through a bouquet of flowers at a dinner party 300 years ago, and it's still fighting today, just in a different form. The same plant that fueled revolutions and built empires is now facing its own kind of war. Climate change shrinking the exact highland regions where wild Arabica still grows, and a global industry still wrestling, right now, with how to make sure the people actually growing these beans get a fair share of what they're worth. The fight didn't end with abolition or independence, it just changed shape. So the next time you're standing in line for your coffee or pouring that first cup at home, take 1 second before you drink it. You're not just caffeinating, you're holding 400 years of empire, rebellion, and human cost in one small cup. If this history hit you the way it hit me, smash that subscribe button, because this is just one story in a world absolutely packed with them. Drop a comment. Which part of this shocked you the most? The Sultan drowning people, the Pope's taste test, or the bouquet full of stolen seeds? I read every single one. And if you want the next deep dive already lined up in your feed, hit that bell, because next time we're going somewhere just as wild. Stay curious. I'll see you in the next one.